Dad, do you know why the army pays me? I looked my father straight in the eye, and for the first time in my life, I watched him flinch away from me instead of toward me. The dining room had gone silent, except for the tick of the old clock Linda kept polished like a trophy. My fork was still in my hand. My voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. Tell your wife to stop counting my money. She doesn't have a right to a single dollar of it. If she crosses that line again, I won't be polite anymore. Do you understand? My father's face went the color of old paper. 3 hours earlier, I had walked through that same front door with my duffel bag still smelling like the tarmac, grateful for a hot meal that wasn't from a dining facility. I hadn't seen my father in 4 months. I hadn't seen this house, his house, Linda's house, in almost a year. I told myself I was tired, that the fatigue in my shoulders was just travel, not dread. I was wrong about that, the way I've been wrong about very few things in my career. Linda greeted me at the door with a hug that lasted exactly as long as it needed to for the photo she wasn't taking. Julia, look at you, so thin. Don't they feed you people? I let it go. I always let the small things go. It's a skill the army teaches you whether you want it or not. You learn to conserve your energy for the fights that matter. Dinner started normal enough. Pot roast, the good plates, my father asking about deployment in that careful way he has, like he's afraid the real questions might break something. Michael was quieter than usual, picking at his food, not quite meeting my eyes. I noticed that. I notice things. It's part of the job. It was Linda who turned the evening. So, Julia, she said, refilling my water glass without being asked, do you still get that housing allowance? BAH, is that what it's called? I told her it was, kept my answer short. She nodded like she was filing something away. And how much do officers make after all these years? You must have quite a savings account by now. I told her that wasn't really dinner conversation. She laughed lightly like I'd made a joke instead of drawn a line. Then she pivoted to Michael, the way water finds the lowest point in a room. Michael's been working so hard on his business plan, she said, and my brother's jaw tightened in a way that told me he hadn't asked her to bring this up. The detailing shop. He just needs a little help getting started. You have the means to help your brother, Julia. I set my fork down. I didn't realize this was what tonight was about. It's not about anything, Linda said too quickly. I'm just saying family helps family. Why are you so interested in my money? I asked her directly. No anger in my voice yet. Just a question, the kind I'd ask in a briefing room when a number didn't add up. Linda's smile flickered, then reset itself smooth as a rehearsed line. I'm not interested in your money. I'm interested in this family staying whole. But even as she said it, she mentioned a number, an approximate figure that sat uncomfortably close to what I actually kept in savings. Not a guess. A number someone would only know if they'd been looking or asking or both. I turned to my father, waiting for him to say something, anything in my defense. Instead, he set his napkin down and said in the gentlest voice imaginable, the voice he used to use when I was 8, and scraped my knee, Linda's just trying to help Michael, honey, that's all. That was the moment. Not Linda's questions, not the number she shouldn't have known. My father choosing the path of least resistance the way he always had since Linda came into our lives, choosing peace over me. Something in my chest went very still the way it does right before a decision gets made and can't be unmade. I didn't raise my voice. I've spent 13 years learning that volume is not the same as authority. I looked at my father, not at Linda, because he was the one who needed to hear it most. Dad, do you know why the army pays me? He blinked, confused by the question, the way people are when you ask them something they think they already know the answer to. It pays me because I show up. Because I do the job nobody wants to do, and I do it well on my own without asking anyone for a dime. That money is mine. It was never a family fund. It was never a resource for anyone to draw from without asking. I let that settle before I finished. Tell your wife to stop counting my money. She doesn't have a right to a single dollar of it. If she crosses that line again, I won't be polite anymore. Do you understand? My father went pale. Linda's mouth opened, then closed. Michael stared at his plate like it held the answer to a question he was too afraid to ask out loud. I excused myself before anyone could speak, walked upstairs to the guest room that used to be mine before Linda redecorated it into something that looked like a hotel suite, and sat down on the edge of the bed with my phone in my hand. My heart still steady, my mind already 3 steps ahead. That's when the email came through, my bank. A request had been submitted just that afternoon asking for verification of my account information. I hadn't made that request. I read it twice then, a third time, and felt something cold settle low in my stomach. Not fear, not yet. Something closer to certainty. This wasn't going to be a one-night conversation. I didn't sleep much that night, not because I was afraid. Fear has never been the thing that keeps me awake, but because my mind works like a checklist when something doesn't add up, and that email sat in my inbox like an unresolved line item I couldn't close out. By 6 in the morning, I had already called the bank's fraud line from the back porch, coffee going cold beside me, while the sun came up over Linda's manicured hedges. The representative walked me through it carefully. No money had been withdrawn, no account had been compromised. But someone had submitted a request for information, the kind of preliminary step you'd take if you were trying to understand what an account contained before deciding what to do about it. Nothing illegal on its face, nothing that would hold up as theft. Just a very specific kind of curiosity, and I already had a good idea whose curiosity it was. I found my father in the kitchen an hour later alone, which was rare in that house. Linda liked to orchestrate mornings the way she orchestrated everything else, but that day she was still upstairs, and I took the opening. "Dad, I need you to be honest with me about something." He looked up from his coffee and I saw it immediately, the flicker of a man who already knew what was coming and had been dreading it since the night before. "Julia, has Linda asked you about my finances, my salary, my savings, anything like that?" He was quiet long enough that I had my answer before he gave it. Then he sighed, the kind of sigh that carries the weight of months, maybe years of small compromises. "She's asked about your pay grade, what you might have saved by now, whether you own the house outright." He rubbed his temple. "She said she was just trying to understand what you could afford in case Michael ever needed help." "That's not her business, Dad." I kept my voice level, though it cost me something to do it. "And it's definitely not yours to hand over." "She's not trying to hurt anyone, Julia. She just worries about Michael. He's not as settled as you are." I wanted to tell him that worry doesn't require a bank balance, that a mother's concern for her son didn't need my account numbers to function. But I let it sit because arguing with my father about Linda's intentions had never once changed his mind, and I wasn't going to waste the morning trying. Linda called me herself around 10 while I was loading my bag into the rental car, planning an early exit that I no longer felt guilty about. Her voice was warm in that particular way that always made the hair on my arms stand up, warmth as a tool, not a feeling. "Julia, honey, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Is that what we're calling it? I would never do anything to hurt this family. Family helps family. That's all I've ever believed in." "Does family also go through each other's finances without asking?" I said it plainly. No heat behind it, just the question sitting there in the open air between us. There was a pause on the line just long enough to tell me I'd landed somewhere true. "I think you're overreacting," she said finally, and the warmth had gone thin at the edges. I hung up without agreeing or disagreeing because I didn't know her either. Michael called an hour after that, and his voice had none of his mother's polish. He sounded tired, maybe a little embarrassed the way people sound when they've been sent to do something they didn't fully sign up for. "Mom says you're refusing to help me," he said, no greeting, straight into it. "Did you ask me for money, Michael?" Silence on the other end. Real silence, not the calculated kind Linda specialized in. Not exactly. I mean, she said you'd offered." "I never offered anything. I never even knew what you needed until last night at dinner in front of everyone." I kept my tone even because none of this was Michael's fault, not really. He was 27 trying to build something of his own, and he'd been handed a story about his sister that wasn't true, and he'd believed it because it was easier than questioning his own mother. "She told me you had plenty," he said quietly, "that you'd want to help. I'd want to know the truth before I decide anything," I told him. "What do you actually need, Michael, from you, not from her?" He hesitated, and in that hesitation I heard something that told me this was bigger than a small business loan. "It's not just startup costs," he admitted finally. "I've got some debt, more than I probably should have taken on. The shop was supposed to help me get out from under it, but the numbers keep moving on me." "How much?" He gave me a figure, and it was not small. It was the kind of number that explained a great deal about why Linda had suddenly become so interested in my finances, and why just a little help had never really meant a little at all. I sat in that rental car for a long moment after we hung up keys in my hand engine, still off turning it over in my mind. Linda hadn't been fishing for pocket change. She'd been building toward something with a much larger price tag, and she'd been laying the groundwork with my father, with Michael, with anyone who might make it easier to get there. I started the engine, but I didn't drive away, not yet. I sat there thinking about the shape of what was coming, and for the first time since I'd walked through that front door the night before, I let myself admit that this wasn't going to end with one uncomfortable dinner. It was going to end with someone finding out exactly what I was willing to do to protect what was mine. I asked Michael to meet me alone away from the house, away from Linda's carefully arranged dinners, and her habit of steering every conversation exactly where she wanted it to go. We picked a diner off the highway, the kind of place with cracked vinyl booths and coffee that had been on the burner too long, and I watched my brother slide into the seat across from me, looking like a man who hadn't slept well in weeks. "Tell me everything," I said. "Not what Mom told you to say. What's actually true." He turned his coffee cup in slow circles before he spoke. The garage business had started as a real plan, detailing minor repairs, the kind of thing he'd apprenticed for since he was 19. But somewhere along the way, impatience and bad advice had turned a modest startup into a hole he couldn't climb out of on his own. Equipment financed at bad rates, a lease he'd signed before he had the income to support it. Credit cards used to cover gaps that kept getting wider instead of narrower. "The bank won't touch me," he admitted. "Not without a cosigner. My credit's shot." And Linda suggested me. He didn't answer right away, which was answer enough. "She said you didn't even have to give me actual money. Just put your name on the loan. Said it was the responsible thing since I'm family and you're, stable." I felt something harden in my chest, quiet and immediate. "Being stable doesn't mean being liable, Michael." "I know that," he said, and for the first time I heard something real in his voice, something that wasn't Linda's script. "I told her I didn't feel right asking you. She said she'd handle it." He looked up at me then, and I saw the beginning of understanding dawn on his face. The same understanding that had been building in me since the bank's fraud line confirmed what I already suspected. "She's been handling a lot of things without telling me the whole truth, hasn't she?" I didn't answer that. I didn't need to. That night, back at the house, Linda made her pitch, formally papers already printed and waiting on the kitchen table like she'd been rehearsing the moment. My father sat beside her quiet, the way he'd been quiet at dinner 2 nights before. "You don't even have to give Michael the money," Linda said, sliding the papers toward me with the practiced ease of someone who believed persistence eventually wore people down. "Just cosign, that's all. It protects everyone." I looked down at the loan documents at the number printed near the bottom and did the math in my head the way I'd been trained to do with anything that had my name attached to it. If Michael missed payments, and given what he'd just told me about his credit, that wasn't a small risk. The full weight of that debt would fall on me. Not partially, fully. My credit, my assets, my future. "No," I said. My father's head came up sharply. "He's your brother, Julia." "Being his sister doesn't make me legally responsible for his debts, Dad." I kept my voice steady, though I could feel the old current of frustration running underneath it, the particular exhaustion of explaining something obvious to people who didn't want to understand it. If I co-sign this and he can't pay, it's not a gesture of love. It's a financial obligation that could follow me for years. Linda's expression shifted, the polish cracking just slightly at the edges. "Your mother would have helped him," she said, and the room went very quiet. I felt that one land somewhere deep, somewhere old, but I didn't let it show. "Don't use my mother to pressure me." I said, each word deliberate. "You didn't know her. You don't get to speak for her." Linda's mouth pressed into a thin line, and for a moment I thought she might back down. Instead, she leaned forward slightly, and her voice dropped into something quieter, almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. "You don't even know what your father has sacrificed for you, Julia. Maybe you should ask him about that before you start acting so certain about who deserves your help." I looked at my father. He wasn't looking at either of us. He was looking down at his hands folded on the table like he was praying for the conversation to end. And something in his stillness told me this wasn't an empty threat. There was something underneath it, something with weight. What is she talking about, Dad? He didn't answer. Linda gathered the loan papers back into their folder with hands that were slightly unsteady and said in a voice gone brittle, "Ask him yourself, it's not my place." That night, I lay awake again, staring at the ceiling of the guest room, running back through every conversation I'd had in that house over the past 2 days. Linda's questions about my finances, the bank request I hadn't authorized, the loan papers ready and waiting like she'd known exactly how the conversation would go before it started. And now this, a reference to some sacrifice my father had made, delivered like a weapon meant to soften me before it was fully explained. I didn't know yet what she meant, but I knew the shape of it the way you know weather is coming before the sky changes color. Something in my family's past had been buried, and Linda had just told me without quite meaning to exactly where to start digging. I thought about my mother gone 11 years now, and the trust she'd left behind for me, money and property I'd never had to think much about because it had always simply been there, managed quietly by my father since I was a girl. I hadn't looked closely at those records in years. I decided lying there in the dark that it was time I did. I called my mother's old attorney the next morning, a man named Walter Hastings, who had handled her estate since before I could remember, and who still sounded exactly the same, careful and precise as he had when I was 19, and signing paperwork I barely understood. I asked him to pull everything, every record, every statement, every document tied to the trust my mother had left me. He said it would take a few days. I told him I'd wait. While I waited, I went back through what I already had. My mother had died when I was 20, cancer that moved faster than anyone expected, and in the aftermath my father had taken over management of the modest trust she'd set up for me, a life insurance payout, some savings, a small piece of property from her side of the family. I had been too young and too grieving to pay close attention at the time, and by the time I was old enough to understand finances properly, I was already at West Point, already building a life that didn't require me to look backward. Now I looked, and what I found didn't sit right. There were gaps, periods where account balances dropped without a clear explanation, followed by slower periods of what looked like repayment. A refinancing on the house, my childhood home that had happened the year I was 23, deployed for the first time too far away and too consumed with survival to notice anything happening back home. My name was nowhere on that refinancing directly, but the timing and the amounts lined up in a way that made my stomach tighten every time I looked at it. My first thought was ugly, and I let myself sit with it for exactly as long as it took to feel ashamed of how quickly I jumped there. He took my money. He used what my mother left me to save his own house. I called Hastings back, half-formed accusations already on my tongue, and he stopped me before I could get far. "Don't assume intent before we have the documents, Julia," he said, his voice calm, in the way that only decades of practice can produce. "Numbers tell you what happened. They don't tell you why. Give me a few more days." It was hard advice to take. I've never been good at sitting still inside uncertainty. It's not how I was trained, and it's not how I'm built. But I trusted Hastings, and more than that, I think some part of me wasn't ready yet to know the answer for certain. While I waited, Michael called again, and this time there was an edge in his voice I hadn't heard before. "I need to tell you something," he said. "Mom's been saying things. To people. She told my landlord you were going to help me catch up on the shop's lease. She told her sister you'd already agreed to the loan." He paused. "She told me days ago that you were going to give me the money, that it was basically settled." "I never said that, Michael, not once." "I know that now," he said, and I could hear something shifting in him, some loyalty that had been misplaced finally finding its correct target. "I think she's been telling people what she wants to be true instead of what's actually true. I didn't realize how far she'd taken it until my landlord called asking when the payment was coming. I closed my eyes for a moment, absorbing that. Linda hadn't just been asking, she'd been building a narrative in which my help was already a foregone conclusion, laying groundwork with people outside our family, so that if I refused, I would look like the one going back on my word instead of the one who'd never given it. "Thank you for telling me," I said, and I meant it. Michael was starting to see the woman, his mother, actually was not the one she performed at dinner tables, and that couldn't have been easy for him. Hastings called 3 days later, and this time his voice had a different quality to it, measured but with an edge of genuine gravity underneath. "I found something you need to see in person," he said. It's not something I want to explain over the phone. I drove to his office that same afternoon and he laid a single document across his desk. A refinancing agreement from 11 years ago, my father's signature at the bottom in handwriting, I recognized instantly. This shows your father accessed a portion of the trust's associated property value during a refinancing, Hastings explained, tapping the page. The timing lines up with a period of significant financial strain, medical bills from your mother's illness likely based on the dates. It doesn't prove intent to deceive. Plenty of people in his position would have done something similar under enough pressure. But it does confirm the funds moved, and it confirms he never disclosed it to you. I stared at the signature for a long time. My father's careful, familiar handwriting, evidence of a decision made in a moment of desperation I hadn't known existed more than a decade ago while I was overseas, learning how to be the kind of person who didn't fall apart under pressure. There's something else, Hastings added, quieter now. The full amount was largely repaid over the following years. Whoever handled that repayment was consistent about it. But there's a more recent set of transactions within the last 2 years that doesn't match that pattern. Different signatures involved in the authorization requests. I'd want to look closer before I say more. Different signatures. I thought immediately of Linda, of her careful questions about my finances, of loan papers printed and ready before I'd even agreed to look at them. Whatever my father had done more than a decade ago out of grief and desperation was starting to look like only half the story. Someone else had picked up where his old mistake left off, and I was beginning to understand that the truth waiting for me wasn't going to be simple, and it wasn't going to let either of us off easily. I asked my father to meet me somewhere that wasn't Linda's house, somewhere she couldn't hover in the next room pretending not to listen. He suggested the small park near where I grew up, the one with the bench overlooking the pond where he used to take me fishing before Linda, before Michael, before any of it. I think he chose it on purpose. I think some part of him hoped the place might soften what he knew was coming. I laid the documents on the bench between us without preamble. The refinancing agreement, the timeline Hastings had built, the gap and the slow, careful repayment that followed it. My father looked at the papers for a long moment, and I watched something in his shoulders give way like a weight he'd been carrying so long he'd forgotten it was there. "I was drowning, Julia," he said, finally, his voice low. "After your mother died, the medical bills didn't stop just because she did. I had maybe 6 months before the house would have gone into foreclosure. I didn't know what else to do. So you used my trust." I used what was available. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself I'd pay it back before you ever needed to know, and I did pay it back, almost all of it, over the next 4 years. I worked 2 jobs for a while. I sold your mother's car. I did everything I could to fix it before it became a problem you'd ever have to carry. He looked at me, then, eyes wet in a way I'd rarely seen from him. "I should have told you. I know that. I've known that for 11 years. Then why didn't you—" My voice cracked slightly on the question, the first crack I'd allowed myself since this whole thing started. "Because I was ashamed," he said simply. "Because you were becoming this incredible, capable woman, and I was afraid that if you knew what I'd done, you'd stop seeing me as your father and start seeing me as someone who failed you. I told myself the silence was protecting you. Really, I think it was just protecting me." I sat with that for a long time, watching a family of ducks cut across the pond's still surface. I was angry and I was hurt. And underneath both of those things was something more complicated, a kind of aching sympathy for a man who had lost his wife and nearly lost his home in the same terrible year, and who had made a desperate choice instead of a criminal one. Hastings had been right not to let me assume the worst. This wasn't theft. This was grief wearing the shape of bad judgment. "I forgive you for that part," I said finally, and I watched relief move through him like water finding a crack. "But you should have told me, years ago, before Linda started asking questions about money that used to belong to my mother." His face changed at that, the relief replaced by something more wary. "What do you mean?" I told him about the second set of transactions, the ones from the last 2 years, the ones with different signatures involved in the authorization. I watched the color drain slowly from his face as I spoke, watched him understand, maybe for the first time, that his old secret hadn't stayed buried. It had become a door Linda had learned to walk through. "She's been asking about beneficiaries," I said. "Hasn't she? About the will, about the house?" He didn't answer right away, which told me everything. She said it made sense to update things, he admitted finally. Now that we're older, now that Michael has a needs of his own. She's mentioned adjusting the beneficiary designations on a few accounts, restructuring some of the property. He rubbed a hand over his face. I didn't think much of it. It seemed practical. Dad, she's been quietly moving pieces of this family's finances toward Michael for months, maybe longer, using the same house, the same accounts you touched during your worst year as leverage. She knew about the old refinancing, didn't she? That's what she meant when she said, I didn't know what you'd sacrificed for me. His silence was confirmation enough. I felt something settle inside me, then cold and clear, the particular calm that comes right before a difficult decision crystallizes into an easy one. This wasn't really about a business loan anymore, or even about my father's old mistake. This was about a woman who had found a wound in this family, and had spent years quietly working her fingers into it, waiting for the moment it would open wide enough for her to walk through with everything she wanted. I have enough here to make this very uncomfortable for her, I told my father. Hastings can trace every one of those recent transactions. I could take this to a lawyer specializing in elder financial matters. Get everything documented. Make this a legal issue instead of a family one. He looked frightened by that, the old instinct to avoid conflict rising up in him even now. Julia, I'm not going to do that, I said, and watched some of the fear leave his face. Not because she doesn't deserve it, because I don't want to turn this family into a courtroom spectacle, and because some part of this is still fixable if you're finally willing to stand up straight in your own house. I gathered the papers back into their folder. But I'm not going to sit quietly while she keeps rearranging things behind your back either. I'm going to get the full picture, every transaction, every signature, every request, and then I'm going to decide what to do with it. My father nodded slowly, and for the first time since I'd arrived 4 days earlier, I saw something in his face that looked less like fear and more like resolve. What do you need from me? He asked. The truth, I said. All of it this time. No more protecting me from things I have every right to know. He promised me that. I wanted to believe him. But I'd learned enough in the past few days to know that promises in that house had a way of bending under Linda's weight, and I intended to make sure this time, whatever happened next, the paper trail would hold even if he didn't. I didn't go back to the house angry. I went back with a plan, which is a very different thing, and one that has served me better in every difficult moment of my life than anger ever has. Hastings and I spent the next several days building a complete picture. He pulled every authorization request tied to the accounts my father still nominally controlled from my mother's original trust, cross-referencing dates, signatures, and the specific language used in each request. What emerged was not chaotic or reckless. It was methodical. Someone had been making small, careful moves over roughly 18 months, a change to a beneficiary form here, an inquiry into refinancing options there, a request for documentation about a property deed that hadn't been touched in years. Whoever did this is patient, Hastings told me, sliding a folder across his desk. They're not trying to take everything at once, they're positioning, getting things ready to move quickly once the opportunity presents itself. I didn't need him to tell me who, I already knew. I didn't confront Linda directly, not yet. That's not how you handle a person who has spent years perfecting the art of sounding reasonable while doing something entirely unreasonable. Instead, Hastings drafted a formal request for documentation, not accusatory, not emotional, simply a series of precise questions about specific transactions and requests made under my father's name over the previous 2 years. It went out under the trust's legal letterhead, addressed to the financial institutions involved with copies to my father as the nominal trustee. Linda found out within a day. She always did. She called me that evening and her voice had lost all of its careful warmth. You're having lawyers send legal letters about our family's finances. Do you understand how that looks, Julia? Using your military connections to intimidate people. My uniform has nothing to do with this, I said evenly. I'm not a major right now, Linda. I'm just a woman asking questions about money that used to belong to my mother, using the same legal process anyone else would use. I let that sit for a beat. You could have answered my questions honestly at dinner 3 weeks ago. You chose not to. This is what happens next. She hung up on me. It was the first time in years I'd heard her lose control of a conversation entirely, and I won't pretend it didn't feel like something shifting into place. Michael called me the next morning, and something in his voice told me he'd finally had the conversation with his mother that had been a long time coming. "I asked her directly," he said. "I asked if she really expected you to co-sign my loan knowing what it could cost you if I couldn't pay. I asked if she'd been the one making all those account inquiries." "What did she say?" "Nothing," he said. "That's the thing, she didn't answer. She got that look on her face, the one she gets when she's deciding how to spin something, and I realized I already knew the answer before she said a word." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry, Julia. I let her use me for a long time without asking enough questions." "You're asking them now?" I told him. "That matters." The biggest shift, though, came from my father, and it came without me pushing for it. He called Hastings' office directly, something he had never done in 11 years of managing that trust, and asked to see every document related to the recent authorization requests. Hastings walked him through it patiently, the same way he'd walked me through it days earlier. My father told me later that seeing his own name on documents he didn't remember signing, alongside notarizations he didn't recall requesting, was the moment something in him finally hardened into resolve instead of avoidance. That night at the house with all three of them present, my father said one word before Linda could redirect the conversation the way she always did. "Enough." The room went quiet, even Linda mid-sentence stopped. "I've spent years letting things slide because it was easier than arguing," he said, his voice steadier than I'd heard it in days. "I let you handle things I should have been paying closer attention to. I let you speak for this family in ways I shouldn't have allowed. That ends now." He looked at Linda directly, something in his posture I hadn't seen from him since before my mother died. "You will not touch anything connected to Julia's mother's estate again. Not the house, not the accounts, not the beneficiaries. If you have concerns about our finances going forward, you bring them to me in the open, not through back channels and paperwork I never agreed to." Linda's composure finally cracked, just slightly at the edges. "I was only trying to secure something for Michael, for his future. Is that such a crime?" "It's not a crime to want to help your son," I said quietly. "It's a problem when you try to do it by quietly rerouting money that was never yours to direct, and by making promises to people using my name without ever asking me." She looked around the room at Michael, who wouldn't meet her eyes, at my father standing straighter than he had in years, at me holding a folder full of documentation that made every one of her careful moves visible in black and white. Something in her face shifted, calculation giving way for just a moment to something that looked almost like fear. "If this family falls apart," she said, her voice tight, "it will be because Julia chose money over family." I looked at her for a long moment before I answered, and when I did, my voice was calm. The same calm I use when a situation has already resolved itself and all that's left is to say so out loud. "No," I said, "you chose money over family. I'm just the one who finally noticed." What happened after that night wasn't dramatic. There was no shouting, no slammed doors, no scene worthy of daytime television. The truth simply settled into the house the way truth does when it's finally been allowed room to breathe quietly and completely. Michael was the first to change course. Within a week, he sat down with a credit counselor on his own without being asked, and started mapping out a real plan to work through his debt instead of looking for someone else to absorb it. He didn't ask me for money again, not once, and he didn't need to. He called me a few days later, his voice steadier than I'd heard it in months, to tell me he'd found a smaller shop space he could actually afford, one that wouldn't require him to lean on anyone. "I should have asked more questions from the start," he told me. "Not just about the money, about why Mom was so insistent on getting it from you specifically." "You're asking them now," I said again, because it was still true and because I meant it as encouragement, not criticism. My father did the harder work of undoing 11 years of silence. He met with Hastings twice more this time to formally close the gap between what he owed the trust and what remained outstanding, insisting on repayment terms, even though I told him it wasn't necessary. He said he needed to do it for himself, not for me, and I understood that in a way I hadn't fully understood before. Some debts aren't about the money at all. He also had the beneficiary designations restored to what they'd been before Linda's quiet adjustments, this time with his own signature made in full awareness, with no one standing behind him whispering what to write. Linda didn't disappear from the family, and I never expected her to, but something essential shifted in that house. She lost the unquestioned authority she'd built over years of careful maneuvering, the assumption that she could speak for all of us, and no one would check the record afterward. My father started reviewing financial documents himself, instead of signing whatever was placed in front of him. Michael stopped treating her requests as instructions and started treating them as opinions, weighed against everyone else's. I heard secondhand that things between her and my father grew strained in the months that followed. Not broken, but different. The kind of different that happens when trust has to be rebuilt from a much lower foundation than it started at. I didn't need her to be punished. I only needed her to stop. The last conversation that mattered happened back on that same bench by the pond weeks later, my father and I sitting in the kind of comfortable silence we hadn't shared in a long time. He'd asked me to come, said there was something he wanted to say without an audience. "Can you forgive me?" he asked, finally not looking at me, looking out at the water instead the way he used to when I was small, and he didn't know how to say something hard. I thought about it honestly before I answered, because he deserved honesty more than he deserved comfort. I thought about the years of silence, the fear that had driven it, the way grief can make good men do things they later can't explain even to themselves. I thought about how he'd finally stood up in his own kitchen in front of the woman he'd let run the household for years and said enough. "I can forgive you, Dad," I said. "But forgiveness doesn't mean giving you access to my money. It doesn't mean things go back to exactly how they were. It means I understand why it happened, and I'm choosing not to carry the anger forward. That's different from pretending it didn't happen at all." He nodded slowly, and I watched something settle in him, something that looked like peace, or at least the beginning of it. After a moment, he asked quieter this time, almost like he was testing whether the old dinner table version of the question could land differently now. "Then why does the army pay you?" I smiled, and for the first time in weeks it came easily. "For my service, Dad," I said, "not for yours." I stood up from the bench, and he stood with me, and we walked back toward the parking lot together in silence that finally felt earned instead of avoided. I didn't win because I had money, or because I wore a uniform, or because I knew how to build an airtight case against people who underestimated me. I won because I finally understood something that took me 31 years and one very uncomfortable family dinner to learn. Being family gives someone a place in your heart. It does not give them ownership of your life. You can love people and still hold your boundaries. You can forgive someone and still refuse to hand them the keys again. Those two things were never in conflict. I just needed to stop believing they were. If you made it all the way to the end of Julia's story, I'd genuinely love to hear what stayed with you. Was it the moment she finally spoke up at that dinner table, or the quiet strength it took her father to finally say enough? Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from tonight. It means more than you know to hear from you. We share stories just like this one every single day, so if this one moved, you consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one. Thank you for spending this time with me. Let's keep this journey going together.